Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Louis Brantmeyer. I am Clever Orbits, along with my co-hosts, Richard Futrell. Richard, say hello.
Hello.
It's always so chipper. Tyler Brantmeyer.
Greetings.
Benjamin Walton Seepe.
Hola.
And special guest star for the evening, one of our recurring guests. I like to think of him as the Harry Mudd of the group, Frank June Kim.
I'm going to steal your starship now. Just warning ahead of time.
Oh, man. Yeah, sorry, Ben. You'll get that in a couple episodes, I think. So today we are talking about The City on the Edge of Forever, heralded as possibly the greatest episode in the Star Trek canon. I'm not sure I would go that far, but definitely the greatest episode, in my opinion, of the original series. And there are a lot of things that I have seen in this episode that were just brilliant, beautiful, cool, and fun. Here I am with my opening salvo already. So the title. Well, Richard, do you want to do a quick summary, just for old time's sake?
Of what happens in the episode?
Yeah, just in case somebody's like, huh.
All right, so the Enterprise is going through space, and they're going through waves of time, and Spock is excited about that, and in the turbulence, McCoy stabs himself and gives himself way too much medicine, way too much cordrazine, I think it is, and he goes crazy. And he beams down to the planet where the center of the waves of time is, the waves of time that they were going through. And the crew follows him, and there's this giant mysterious portal there, and it has a bunch of sort of gnomic, Delphic statements that are very interesting. It starts showing them scenes from their past. McCoy runs in there, presumably does something in the past where he's transported, and suddenly the Enterprise crew finds themselves on the planet with no contact with the Enterprise, no contact with anyone. Kirk makes a log entry in which he says stardate none because we're outside of time. They're just totally isolated. They decide to go back in time themselves to stop McCoy from doing whatever it is he did there. So now they're in Depression-era New York, it seems like, 1930. They fall in with this woman, Edith, who runs a soup kitchen, and they are bums working in the soup kitchen. This is Kirk and Spock, and they're looking out for McCoy, and they want to stop McCoy from doing whatever he wants to do. Over time, Kirk sort of falls in love with Edith, because she's this, attractive do-gooder lady. And Spock's working on building a computer. McCoy eventually shows up, and he's still crazed from the high cordrazine he took. And around this time, Spock figures out that what changed the future and prevented the Enterprise from existing was that this woman, Edith, did not die. She was supposed to die. In the future that led to the Enterprise, she did not die, and that led to the future that didn't have the Enterprise. Now Kirk's in trouble because he loves Edith, and he has to not save her from dying in a car accident, apparently. Anyway, eventually McCoy shows up, and McCoy and Spock hold back Kirk as he tries to save Edith as a car is oncoming, and the car hits her, and she dies, and the future is restored. They go back into the future, and the Oracle says, "Many such journeys are available to you now."
Yeah.
And Kirk says, nope. He says, beam us up. Get us the hell out of here. And that's the episode.
And scene. Richard, I knew that your summary would be extremely elegant and fascinating this time. For some reason, I just had an intuition. So, man, actually, one thing I want to augment or shift in that was that the scene at the end always gets misremembered. You always think it's Spock and McCoy holding him back, but if you go back and rewatch, it is actually McCoy and Kirk holding each other, and Kirk is holding McCoy back, interestingly enough. But the thrust of the narrative leaves you with the feeling that Spock and McCoy are holding Kirk back. So I totally understand that.
And also it's because they did this weird thing where that in the sequence of shots for that last scene, they have a shot where Kirk realizes McCoy is back and because of something Edith said, and so he yells Spock, and he runs across the street, and gets there just as Spock comes from outer frame, and they meet in front of the front entrance to that soup kitchen. So there's this shot of Kirk and Spock, and then behind them from the background, the door opens and McCoy comes out, and they all embrace each other. They give each other a group hug, and they're like very enthusiastic. But it's a very quick shot. Lasts like probably less than 2 seconds of those three men. And so then with her walking across the street and getting hit by the truck and everything, and then him, like, Kirk kind of like lunges for her, but then stops when Spock says, Jim, and then McCoy immediately starts to make a beeline towards her, and then that's when Kirk grabs McCoy, and they hold each other pretty much, and Kirk actually has his back turned, so he doesn't see her dying. But anyway, because of all that and the narrative thrust that Lewis was referencing, it almost does feel like they're trying to hold him back almost, especially when Kirk turns his back and is unable to like bring himself to witness her death.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. That's beautiful. Skipping ahead a little bit, the classic representation, which you can see pictured here, is reason holding and will holding back emotions. Kirk represents will, emotions is McCoy, and Spock is reason. This is the classic kind of Aristotelian, Platonic, three-part soul division that we're given in ancient Greek philosophy. And so it's really powerfully displayed, and one would totally walk away from it with the feeling of Spock is holding him back, because Spock is kind of standing for the ethical high ground. And anyway, to return to the opening salvo, I want to talk about the title. I want to talk about The Guardian of Forever. I want to talk about Kirk and then Edith Keeler, because there's a lot to see and to discover here. First of all, the title is originally left over from Ellison's story, referring to something Kirk says when he sees the city of the Guardians of Forever. And we'll get into the comic book a little later and the differences, but initially the title might not seem to have that much meaning. However, the city on the edge of forever is New York. The city on the edge of forever is also whatever was those ruins where the Guardian of Forever now sits, because the key to all of space and time, potentially, is the Guardian itself. And by extension, when we look at how an individual's actions can impact the whole of the world, whether through their direct living contribution by saving or not saving a life, or dying, we realize that we too are inhabiting currently the city on the edge of forever, that all of time and space could depend on choices that you or I make, which is advancing a little far into the moral sense of the story. But, so just to start, or men, we are men. The writing is excellent. The way the knowledge of his fate grows on Kirk, the way that Kirk and Spock, work together, Spock's supportiveness, and then Keeler's putting a literal face on what's best in the Star Trek worldview. So first of all, this episode has very vividly portrayed, and very early on in the canon of Star Trek, the sheer inconceivable enormity and weight of dealing with some of the issues of temporal ethics. I almost invited Stephen on to talk about how this is basically the trolley problem. You either let one woman die or a lot of other people die. And we may have a follow-up with him at some point. But that in itself, sacrificing one for the sake of many, that's already a difficult choice. Knowing that the whole history of history ends up being impacted by that choice is somehow, by the beauty of the writing, realistically humanized and portrayed and personalized in Kirk, so he has an arc in this episode, right? And I'm just going to go through it. One of my favorite things is when he arrives in the past, he's got a wry smile on his face. And every bit of fear or doubt you may have had as the viewer about the survival of the crew or whatever just evaporates, because you know that everything's going to be okay. He's in flow. He's having fun. He's here in the past because he wants to enjoy what there is to experience in being there. And I think he's right to have that thought, especially when I cover what the Guardian of Forever means and what its true intentions are and how it's actually working. And then there's other moments like Kirk baiting Spock, which is just cute and fun. You can tell that he's enjoying himself, both the actor and the character. And then when he meets Edith Keeler, it's like love at first sight. The music tells us as much, even if Kirk isn't conscious of it. And, he's already chivalrous with her by the next scene with the bum in the soup kitchen. He's protecting her honor in not allowing the bum to talk about how he'd like to, have her or whatever. And so it fits with his character, especially as portrayed in the Prime Timeline. In the Prime Timeline, so we just finished the Kelvin Timeline movies, and probably Chris Pine's Kirk, by the time this event happens, if it's after Beyond, would respond in these ways. But in the Prime Timeline, we got Kirk fully mature from moment one. He was responsible, he was respectful, he was honorable, he was courageous, he was fearless, he was a good leader, and he was intelligent. And so, he's just enjoying engaging with the situation. Now, what's beautiful about him in this arc that he goes through is a realization and an incorporation of the self-awareness around his own fallibility when it comes to his own emotions and his own intentions. He finds out from Spock, right, that Edith Keeler must die, which, to anyone who's curious, there is a band already called Edith Keeler Must Die. I'm sorry, it's taken. But, I knew somebody would love that. So in the comic book, and this is where Harlan Ellison, and I know, Frank, you have stuff to say, but hold your horses. We'll come back to it. Harlan Ellison only had the story Bible when he was originally writing this story. So the way that the characters developed, Spock being smarter and stronger than Kirk, being emotionally stolid and stoic, and then, nobody in Starfleet being evil. There were all these little subtleties that in the comic book version and in Harlan Ellison's script, they don't fit with how Star Trek eventually showed up, and especially as expressed in this episode in the first 2 years. So I'm glad that story exists, but it is not Star Trek according to canon, for sure, and it also doesn't really jive with what we know of the characters. One piece of which was that Kirk finds out that from Spock that Edith Keeler must die, and he says, you know what? That can't be. You don't know that. That's false. In the comics, he's resistant to the knowledge that Edith Keeler must die because he is falling in love with Edith Keeler. And there's a subtlety here that most people miss, which is that in the show, he falls in love with her long before he learns, and long meaning like 10 minutes of screen time, long before he learns that she has to die. And so it's a conflict that he readily acknowledges to Spock. He declares to Spock, basically, I'm emotionally compromised. And it wasn't, in the comic there's a line from Spock where he says, Captain, if you want me to change my opinion that you're in the wrong here, just order me to do so. Because, you're my superior officer in telling you that Edith Keeler must die and you must let go of her. But here in the show, they're working together, and Spock is working to support Kirk. Spock is working to serve and honor the highest good, and Kirk is just the same. Kirk isn't this kind of measly, selfish, but I'm in love with her, so I'm going to be in denial. No, here he's honorable and he's responsible, and he's even responsible to the point of when Edith Keeler is falling down the stairs, right, he grabs her because that's his initial impulse. He's the hero. He's a respectful, honorable, compassionate, caring guy. And that was his initial impulse. So there's a lot of interesting depth here because he has to learn to incorporate overriding that ethical impulse. I can hear him speaking to himself as he walks down those stairs, kind of dead-eyed, thinking, I can't allow that to happen. I have failed. Like when he did that, I can imagine him thinking, I have failed, and feeling a lot of guilt and a lot of shame and a lot of making himself wrong, which is why, he eventually is able to override his own impulse because he had that moment of seeing himself falter and then chose, you know what, that's not going to happen again. That can't happen again. And so the other thing that's beautiful and tragic is the awareness that we all should have of our partners, of our experience of loved ones. I mean, by now, every one of you on this podcast on this team should know that I personally love and appreciate you as a brother, as a part of my life. Like that consciousness that we bring into the world of the fact that you all are going to die. He has that. Kirk has that, and he has that with like a ticking time bomb too. So he knows the preciousness of the moments of connection that are happening between us. The preciousness of the moments of like, I got to kiss you outside of your apartment. Like he had a creeping suspicion at that point based on what Spock had said. So like that's, to me, super beautiful and elegant and subtle. So anyway, the climax of the episode, as I already went through, was Spock restraining, Kirk, Spock and McCoy restraining Kirk. Well, actually, cancel that. You're right. McCoy did not restrain Kirk. We went to great pains to show that it was Kirk restraining his own emotions symbolically, basically. And I think what's cool is Kirk suffers from the James Bond Casanova thing. Here's what I mean by that. So you don't see him in many romances up to this point in Star Trek. You don't see him as the ladies' man, especially not the way you see him with Chris Pine later on. You see him maybe having one casual kind of connection where he actually takes a woman out on a date midway through season 1. And so this reputation that he has later on of being a ladies' man, of being an ass chaser, of whatnot, it's the same thing that I saw happen with James Bond. So not all of the Bonds, but James Bond portrayed in On Her Majesty's Secret Service and portrayed in Casino Royale. We know that, the only time James Bond gets married, from what I can tell, from what I remember, in the canon of that fictional universe, is in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And she's brutally murdered in front of him. And the end of the film is just as tragic as this. And I read a great article that explained that his desire for women was his, and this is kind of what I took from it afterwards, it was his kind of deep desire for intimacy and connection, the same one we see with Vesper in Casino Royale after she's taken from him. Like, it gets expressed as chasing after women, but it's really a deep affection for femininity and a deep love and appreciation and an awareness on a subconscious level of the need for intimate connection. But it shows itself. So basically, his heart is so shattered, he is so broken by the experience that you see here that it echoes through the rest of Star Trek, where, he's not able to have a long-term relationship. And there are other reasons for this, like him being a captain, being on the move, being married to his ship, to his job. But I would venture to say that he's broken in a real, meaningful, lasting way by this episode and by his experience of losing Edith Keeler and making the choice, which, to get onto Keeler, and don't worry, this is going to go forever, Keeler, in giving voice to the hope that the bums have in a future that she just intuits, where people will travel in space and things will be better for us, she gives voice to the central message of the show itself, which makes it ironic and fascinating that she has to sacrifice herself, not consciously, not willingly, not knowing anything about the nature of the things that happen. And one imagines that if she had known what the choice was, get hit by this car or Hitler comes to power and kills many people and the entire universe reshapes itself, she would have made the choice that allowed her to die. And so, it's funny because the one who puts a face on Star Trek in this episode, who incarnates kind of the central values of Star Trek, which is part of why Kirk falls so deeply in love with her, she ends up having to sacrifice herself. She doesn't consciously, as I said, but she must die. And in that, I see the same willingness that we see in Spock in Star Trek II, in Kirk in Star Trek Into Darkness, in Data in Nemesis, this willingness to die, and sacrifice one's identity or one's self or one's life for a higher ideal. Now, here's the cool thing about that. Everybody thinks the Guardian of Forever is just nuts, right? There's it doesn't make any sense. There's a quote from Star Trek Department of Temporal Investigations, Watching the Clock. There's a temporal teacher named Tevis, of course a Vulcan, who is quoted as saying, "Let me be your gateway, indeed. What sort of guardians eagerly invites strangers to ransack the very thing it's guarding. Its behavior was not remotely rational or consistent. I dare say the device's artificial intelligence has been in an advanced state of deterioration for a considerable period of time. We're better off without it now. So, we don't like to say that things are crazy here because it's not as interesting. And I'm not going to say that it's an impossible, contingency. Like, that is a place we can go narrative-wise. But I don't agree. This is a million-year-old guardian of forever. So things implied by the concept of the guardian of forever. Time travel is accepted and widely used, ethically acceptable, and fairly pervasive. Like when it was created, the guardian of forever had a real purpose and was given a real mission. And the guardian, in order to carry out that mission, perceives all of space and time, right? So my thinking is what Trexpertise calls an artificial superintelligence, which is not a term just from that video, which is a great video. Everybody should check it out, on artificial intelligence in Star Trek. It is a term from artificial intelligence research, where AI advances not just beyond general artificial intelligence and having all the capacities that we have as human brains and thinkers and problem solvers in the world, but it is something that is far beyond what we're capable of. Something like what you see in Her, when the main character evolves and is able to speak to hundreds of people, having multiple conversations at once, and writing a book and doing philosophy all at the same time. The being, I contend, that is housed in or combined with or incarnated as the guardian of forever is an artificial superintelligence. And therefore, those snide comments like, oh, your little intellect can't understand what I'm saying, like, that's because it's probably true. Now, I contend that it's actually also a deception. I think that the guardian of forever created this whole situation. And let me assert this. So, upon engaging with the guardian, the people who engage with it, they make a lot of assumptions. They don't really ask for help. They aren't given any safety protocols or training by the guardian. It's not a very effective guardian at that point. You'd think if you were a guardian, you would tell us how to use this intelligently. You'd turn off or something when somebody was making an unauthorized incursion without education into the past beforehand. And so, it might better be called the invasion of forever from that perspective. Like, there's more chance for danger and disturbance of the timeline due to its existence. So that's why I don't take that view. It's not insane because, then it's just dumb. It's stupid. So what I saw here is it's lonely, yes. It's a person on some level. It's lonely, and it's underutilized. And the artificial intelligence fomented the whole situation in order to test humanity in its resolve to protect the timeline at any cost. And you can see this. So the time waves floating through space, they hit the Enterprise. And one must imagine, and this might be a stretch, but one must imagine that an artificial superintelligence able to observe all of space and time can probably predict human behavior, can probably predict what's going to happen when the Enterprise encounters something, and can probably, I would even venture to say, do things like make that console explode, knowing that it would necessitate certain other actions. And so this causes the whole thing to go into a completely different light, where the Guardian of Forever at the end says what? More journeys are possible. Let me be your gateway. It feels like they've passed a test. It feels like the Guardian has chosen Kirk as the representative of humanity and has said, hey, I'm going to let you play in the timeline. I'm going to create a situation where you either have to sacrifice what is highest and what you most want for the sake of the safe and healthy flow of time, or if it's a Guardian of Forever, it's not going to cause a situation or allow a situation that would mess up all of time. That's unless it's crazy, which, so that's an alternative reading. So anyway, that is my thinking about the nature of the gateway. I think it's beautiful and interesting and fascinating when it says it's my own beginning and my own ending. I think that it has manipulated certain travel to take place through time in order to ensure its own beginning and the end of its existence as well, which is such a fascinating concept if we take this reading of that character of that concept. And so anyway, this has been my opening salvo. Thank you so much. let's go to Frank to start. Frank, what did you think of the episode?
Well, I've always enjoyed this episode ever since I first saw it, and it, to me, in my mind, it's kind of the predecessor for not only how Star Trek has treated time travel, but how many, many other writers and creatives have thought about and kind of treat time travel and the nature of time travel in their own stories and works. And so, yeah, I think it's great. I think the most brilliant part of it, especially given Harlan Ellison's later feud with Gene Roddenberry over this script, is that Harlan Ellison brought in he made real the dilemma faced by the whole Vulcan creed of the good of the many versus the good of the one or the few. And so he really made that present in this episode, and gave audiences a chance to really enjoy something as a piece of pop fiction, and at the same time left them thinking deeper about the meaning of those themes that you were touching upon earlier. What does it mean to sacrifice one person, no matter how good they are, for the benefit of millions of other people that you'll never meet. So yeah, just a brilliant episode and one of my favorites.
Thank you, Frank. I know you also read the comic, and we'll certainly circle back around to that. It's a great story unto itself, I think, the comic, especially with the elaboration on the Guardians of Forever. Richard, what are your thoughts, man?
Yeah, so I came to similar conclusions to you about what is the mission of the Guardian Forever, what is the question that it's getting answered, what's the test that it's putting Kirk through, in that it's basically what would you sacrifice for something. I think there's maybe more to it, though, than just temporal integrity. So this thing is 10 million years old. I have to imagine that in 10 million years, many things like the Federation come and go. I don't think it particularly cares that, the Enterprise is there. I think what it's testing Kirk on is something more like, what would you give to maintain the something like your ideals, something like the mission you're on, something like the thing that the institutions and the things that you're proud of, the things in your history that you stand on top of. So when Kirk and McCoy, and when everyone's on the planet and they're cut off from the Enterprise and the past has changed, they think we have to change the past to get it back to how it was. They never ask, what if it's actually better now? They just assume axiomatically that they're living in the best of all possible timelines and they need to give it back. So they're assuming that their history, the thing that they've built through so much sacrifice, the tower of history that they're standing on top of, is so good and so worth fighting for that they need to save it. And I think what the Guardian Forever is looking for is maybe what you can see it doing is sort of sifting through the timelines and finding the ones that people are willing to fight for.
That's fascinating.
It's and the way it does that is it says, okay, Kirk, you're Captain Kirk. Your identity is centered around your placement within Starfleet and the Federation and this utopian future where everyone is peaceful, where you've discovered peace is the answer. Now we're going to throw you back in time to a place where you have no identity, you have no money, you have no connections to anyone, and it's a place where your ideals in their simplest form aren't going to work. So there's this part where Kirk says peace is the answer, and Spock responds, the right answer is wrong time.
Yeah.
So it's, he's putting Kirk in the Guardian's putting Kirk in this position where he has to paradoxically sort of locally betray his ideals in order to globally achieve them. And I think that's the nature of that's the question he's asking, is what would you give to preserve that tower of history you're standing on top of that you fought for?
Wow. That is a brilliant, brilliant reading. I especially like that standing there, the only real, meaningful representation of that future is Edith Keeler herself. It becomes all the more paradoxical that they have to kill her or let her die. All of history is just their faith and their prayer that this thing will work out and that there is a thing at the end of all that they're all striving through. It's just an idea in her mind and in Spock and Kirk and McCoy's mind eventually when he comes out of his stupor. this idea that there's a better timeline, that there's a better future even. And so, like, it's a stark willingness to fight for a concept of what's possible and to stand in what's possible in the face of literally an entire world, an entire universe disagreeing with you. The no agreement of the entire universe. It's like epic. It's an epic ethical and like moral quest at that point. Did I kind of catch what you were saying, Richard?
Yeah, it's a quest that is worthy of a, you know, possibly eternally existing mysterious oracular device.
Yes, exactly. Which there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had around like what created that thing and where did that civilization go and why and how is it still around? What does the ending mean? And anyway, but yeah, that's great. So Tyler, what did you think of this, man?
I liked it. I love you, Tyler.
We all love you, Tyler. That's great. But the acting, you and Frank are kind of the resident actors on this show. What did you think of the acting? You could just say stellar. I mean, whatever you want to say.
I would say it's interstellar. Young Collins stand out. And, of course, DeForest Kelley, well, he has a unique insight on what it means to be insane playing a doctor. Or Dr. McCoy has a unique insight on what it means to be insane. And even states as such, demented, etc.
Yeah.
You're
totally right.
Care. Yeah.
There's like a really intricate unfolding of a lot of aspects of philosophical investigation here, because like McCoy is dealing with the nature of what it means to be either hallucinating or is what he's experiencing real, and like how can I make reliable judgments on whether or not what I'm experiencing is real, and what confirms that what I'm experiencing is real. He seems to be okay once he encounters Kirk and Spock, but you're totally right. He's got unique insight into what it means to be insane as a doctor. Did you have more, Tyler? Sorry.
I just thought it was interesting that he blamed Cordrazine for the entire incident, but what he didn't realize was that he was actually in the past, which he eventually realizes. But
yeah,
that was a cool little. There's a cool little interplay in his mind as an actor and as the character.
Especially considering he actually is coming to the most rational Occam's razor-supported conclusion. Like he was handling Cordrazine. He's been out of it for a while. He's just out of it enough to realize that probably something went wrong with the Cordrazine. So he's making the best available conclusion given the evidence. And it just happens to be completely false. And you know, that always was curious to me why McCoy does whatever he does in the past that sets history askew. Like, one imagines that he wouldn't intentionally go about messing everything up, but you can already see the seeds of it right there in him saying, everything else is real, but I've decided that you're not. And you can feel his empathy for her at that moment and his willingness to help her. And then you see it later on in the episode when Kirk holds him back. So, like, yeah, that's really pointed, Tyler. Thank you.
That's what I'm here for.
So finally, last but not least, on our first orbit of this, Ben.
All right, so everything I'm about to say, I just need to remind anyone listening and you guys, this is all predicated on the fact that I've never seen Star Trek the original series, and this was my first episode to see. So I don't have this knowledge of the canon or the storyline or really anything except the Kelvin timeline. So based on that, I was trying to make sense of what's going on in the episode as it was progressing. And part of what I started to think about was related to what Tyler was saying, that McCoy at one point implies this is all a trick, that this is all being staged, that this is all some sort of, in a way, a performance that's going on. And that started to make me wonder if Starfleet or if the Guardian himself was in some way testing Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise. And because a lot of things seem to come together, like Edith, them all being in the same situation. I mean, Kirk even says that McCoy could have showed up in Outer Mongolia, but why were they here? Why were they interacting with Keeler? Why was she like the connecting point to all of them?
Exactly.
And I thought it was kind of a test of, you could say, personal desire, what Kirk thinks is right, or the mission. Because, like you said, Keeler basically vocalizes the entire mission of Starfleet at one point, almost like she's there to test them in their resolve to be able to handle their mission in the face of any sort of adversity, particularly their own mind working against them.
Oh, wow.
And I just thought that was, for me, like I said, without the knowledge of the canon, it was almost solidified in the very bleak way at the end of the episode when they ask what happened, and Spock just replies, "We were successful." And then let's get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
So I viewed this as a test of the resolve of the crew of the Enterprise.
You know, you bring up an interesting issue, too, which is that maybe this was all a hallucination for the members of the away team or the members on the crew. We know that there are, from other episodes, intelligences that can cast this wide a net of illusion. And so yeah, we actually, given that, it may actually be the case that, I mean, it's more interesting if we pull on the thread of it being real, the time travel, and like those issues being worth wrestling in it, but it's certainly a possible reading to say that it's all an hallucination created by the Guardian of Forever.
Oh, I'm not even saying it's a hallucination. I think they legitimately were sent back in time and could have affected the space-time continuum, but there was enough faith in the crew of the Enterprise to do the right thing that's why they were the ones that were assigned, in a sense, to do this.
Ah, interesting.
It was kind of like the ultimate mission.
Yeah, in fact, to follow out on how the right people were selected, there is a really great short story in Strange New Worlds, a fan-made collection, anthology of short stories in the Star Trek universe called Triptych. And it's about what happens in a version of the timeline where Kirk and Spock are not successful. And so, you know, Scotty and Uhura jump back, or actually it's Scotty paired with somebody else and then Uhura paired with somebody else. So those two crewmen are actually vital as well to the mission, given that extension and interpretation of the episode where in one version of the timeline with only a couple of them back there and not the whole away team, Kirk gets killed. Like Kirk is the one who gets hit by the car and all of history is messed up because of that. So in the third version of the timeline, if anybody's counting, it's a great story. Like the entire crew is necessary to restore it. So anyway, anything else from you, Ben? Anything on this?
I did certainly appreciate the 60s Hollywood aspect of it. I was reminded a lot of the old Twilight Zone series, which I still to this day think is some of the best science fiction writing in the history of cinema. But I was paying attention to a bunch of little things, like how Ea kept saying Clark Gable movie, and I just thought it was funny because in 1930, no one would know who the hell Clark Gable is. It wasn't until 1931 that Clark Gable was given a actual moniker on a movie poster.
Interesting. So it was a historical inaccuracy.
Innocent. I mean, I understood why they had to do it, because if they actually did refer to any actor from that time period, no one would have known what the fuck they were talking about.
Yeah, unless they'd referred to one with a big enough name.
Yeah, if they said we're going to go see it happen one night, people would have just been confused in the 60s. So that was just the cinephile in me having some fun with the episode.
Yeah. So now we start our second orbit, right? And what I'd like to talk about, that I'm curious about, is with this super intelligence of the Guardian of Forever. Like, what is it like to be that Guardian? And a lot of interesting thoughts came up for me, like what if the Borg assimilated the Guardian of Forever? How messed up would the universe be? Or what if the Borg assimilated the EMH or Data by extension? That there would be such a strange, ridiculous impact on the whole timeline. But with the Gateway specifically, like, what do we think was, other than the test, which it seems like we mostly think was probably going on, like what is it like to be that Gateway? What is it like to be the Guardian? Richard, any thoughts?
I think it's probably pretty cool.
I think part of, it depends on, we don't really know what its function is. But I would hypothesize that its function is to do this sort of timeline sifting. It's to find the timelines that people are willing to make the sacrifices for preserving. And so I'd imagine it has just a view of all the possible pasts and futures.
and it sees what sort of test particles are moving around in those past and futures, what the people that it could put through tests in order to verify a particular hypothesis about what timeline is good and worth fighting for and which one isn't.
Interesting. So it determines what the proper flow of time is then.
Or I don't know if there is a real sense of proper, but it finds ones that pass the test that it gives, which is what will people sacrifice for.
Yeah, I thought it was really weird and strange when it says, I mean, and you could just perceive this as oracular statements, right? But, you know, I am my own beginning and my own ending. I am both machine and being, and neither. There's in the extended canon, the artificial intelligence actually inhabits the Guardian of Forever, or the beta canon, the expanded universe, whatever. And at a certain point, there's somebody lets the artificial intelligence loose from the Guardian, and so it gets to explore. And one must imagine that, or I like to imagine that it is not only so good at its job, and it's not only done its job so well over time, given its capacity to perceive all of space and time, that it's bored, and it's lonely, and it's curious, and it's interested in doing something more than what it's been doing. And so I like to think that it's moving on a path towards achievement of some kind of finite goal. Otherwise, like, its task is intractable, and, like, you know, it also seems to be there. It does seem to have a safeguard over time. Like, it does also seem to be there to make sure that things stay as they were, as they're supposed to be, which there's a whole conversation which we've introduced with the Kelvin movies around, like, what is time and the timeline supposed to be. So anyway, I guess we've orbited that enough. Frank, I know you've got a great deal more that you want to share. Please, anything.
Well, regarding the function of the Guardian, you know, I think part of it is when it talks about how it's beyond the understanding of even an intellectual powerhouse like Spock. It could be, you know, on the one sense, that could just be the writer, like, giving a very convenient way to get out of actually explaining what it is because it's so advanced. But if we were to take that literally within the context of the story, you know, it could be a very, very advanced supercomputer. It could, you know, it even kind of dodges the question when Kirk asks, "Are you machine or being?" It says, "I'm both and neither." And so, yeah, it's very cryptic, and we can only speculate what it actually is. But one thought that I had rewatching that scene recently is that if you look at like the progression, you know, a lot of, like, scientists have been thinking about this whole question of, like, technological singularities, that at a certain point, you know, computers will become smart enough to start innovating on their own without input from humans. And when that happens, the progression of technological advancement perpetrated by technology itself will far exceed human innovation using technology. So at that point, you know, anything goes. Like, there would be innovations and advancements that we can't even imagine right now. And so in that sense, when I watched that scene, it was kind of like, well, maybe there was at some point in the past this race that evolved organically, like all the life in the galaxy, and then they created a supercomputer, or maybe a network of computers that started to advance, and they hit a technological singularity and began outstripping what this race was capable of. And so if that happened, it's conceivable that that technology then became its own sort of ecosystem that created a space in which technology evolves according to their own pressures. And so the Guardian could just be the product of, like, successive generation after generation of highly advanced computers that may even have at some point enfolded the biological life into it in some way and just kept evolving, and to the point where it now has control of some sort of exotic energy that allows it to see through time and everything. So, yeah, that being the case, it kind of makes sense that it would just be so advanced that, like, it would tell Spock, like, you can't even understand what I am, because it's been billions of years. Oh, and by the way, when I'd forgotten that it said that line about how, what was it? I was here before the sun burned hot in space and before your race was born. if you go by the age of the sun, that puts the Guardian at just over 4.6 billion years old. Billion with a B. So it's been around for a very, very, very long time, and it was probably that's that's just when it's in answer to when Kirk was I forget what he said, something about he asked a question. Oh, he asked Spock, then what is it regarding the Guardian? And then before Spock can answer, that's when the Guardian first speaks, and it says a question. Since before your sun burned hot in space and before your race was born, I have awaited a question. So it actually hasn't had any contact with at least organic life forms that are capable of asking questions for at least 4.6 billion years. So it's just been passively inert, like passively active, I guess, for that long. So yeah, like you were saying, Lewis, maybe it's bored because it's just been sitting around for 4.6 billion years doing nothing. But the other kind of thought that I had about that is, if it's truly that old, and actually the fact that he can even tell Kirk, because like they beam down to the planet, they're there for a few minutes, and in that span of time, the Guardian has sussed out, without speaking, it's sussed out who these people, these aliens are that have beamed down to this planet and where they came from, specifically the humans.
And it speaks their language. Yeah.
And it speaks their language, yeah. Which Ellison's script kind of addresses that a little bit, which we can go into later. But all that being the case, I think that it's also possible it's part of some galactic network, and so it has access to information that's non-local. So somehow, within the span of a few minutes, it can analyze an alien and then know how to speak its language, how it thinks, and be able to communicate back in some sort of vaguely coherent way, even though it sounds like riddles to us. And at the same time, it knows, like, oh, this alien came from this particular planet in the Orion arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and the planet is this old, like the star is this old, and all that. Like, somehow it knew all that information. So it's either at that point a god, or it has access to just immense amounts of data, light years away, parsecs away. And so, yeah, given all that, it could just be this entity that you can't really classify anymore as a machine or organic. Like it could just be connected at a quantum level to pretty much all other aspects of the galaxy, if not the universe. And that could also explain why it says it's its own beginning and its own end. Because I think some of you guys have technical training and all that. For the audience members that don't, there's this whole theory right now in quantum physics known as the Everett many worlds theory, and it takes place in like certain hierarchies. And one of them is that our entire universe, as vast as it is merely one, like, analogous to one foam bubble, like one soap bubble floating in an immense sea of other bubbles that are other universes. And that as these universes, like bubbles do, they can bump into each other and kind of like cohere to one another and all these things. And so within this quantum foam, you have the potential, although it's highly unlikely, like orders of magnitude unlikely, that as bubbles connect, like they influence each other. So universes influence other universes potentially. And all that is to say, well, I'm sure this isn't what Ellison was thinking about when he was writing this script, or any of the other Star Trek writers, but it's, if we're just going to speculate out loud here, maybe what this thing is, this Guardian is it's like become, either through evolution or technological advancement over billions of years, it has actually managed to be able to sort of permeate the quantum foam. And so when you do that, it's very possible that you could scan through an entire history of a race that you just met and say, oh, okay, they're from this version of a universe where they evolved this way, and then they had this history, and now I can send them back if I want to 1930 and test them in all these interesting ways and whatnot. And yeah, so that I kind of feel like it is some sort of this like entity that has this crazy amount of information. It could actually even be a controlled singularity, because according to our current understanding of physics, that's possible too, that within a black hole, you can actually scan the entirety of all the information that's knowable within a black hole based on just just knowing the surface area of it versus the volume. Crazy stuff. But anyway, so yeah, maybe that's what it does. It can just kind of tap into singularities in other universes and be like, oh, yeah, that's the history there. And I actually don't believe it when Spock even says, after McCoy jumps through, Spock asks the machine, can you slow down the progression of history so that we can jump into the time that he did? And the machine says no. the rate is the rate at which it progresses. And so I don't buy that because it already has so much power and information. You can't slow down how fast your PowerPoint slideshow of time progresses. No. So yeah, I think it was probably testing them, like you guys are saying, and that there was a ulterior motive that it's not revealing to them.
Oh man, I love all of that. That is fascinating. You're right that. So I calculated it from when Spock says it's like at least 10 centuries old or 100 centuries or something. But you're right. The Guardian itself knows better how old it is, and the tricorder probably is just wrong. And then if this was a biological species that evolved, it could make sense of the ruins, like that they actually transcended into this being, or eventually they just let go of their corporeal existence, or maybe they all gave themselves. Maybe that was where their obsession with sacrifice started, was the fact that they all gave themselves up and their embodiment for the sake of becoming this consciousness that can observe and manage all of space and time.
One of the ideas is that if we ourselves in our actual timeline here, if we were ever hit a technological singularity, then it's not even like a logarithmic acceleration of technological progress. It would be like something like an exponential thing. It's one theory, but the idea is that if a machine, especially a computer network that spans the entire Earth, could just start innovating on its own, and it has access to things like mining machines and like power grids and things like that, like there's no reason that it can't just like from one day to the next just completely transform what we know of as our physical reality. If something like that happens, then as the machines start to evolve and get smarter and more powerful, there would still be like cities around, right? Like Austin would still be here, but it's possible that at that point it's the quality of like how we live our lives. Like all of a sudden cars are irrelevant because the machine had suddenly invented teleportation, for example. So you'd still see the relics of our pre-technological singularity society around if it hasn't just been usurped and repurposed. So you'd still see buildings and cars and all that stuff, but then the people might have just disappeared within a year, because within that year so much has changed that like even the nature of existence has become reframed. And so, yeah, like an alien who arrives 1 year after the technological singularity to Earth might find the entire planet abandoned, but it could just be that we're all existing in some digitized form somewhere, or have transcended to another universe or whatever.
Hence I am my own beginning. Like if the people who created it were it, then there was continuity of existence. Like they didn't cease. They created it and then they became it. Which
they might have, yeah, exactly. And if the Guardian, if the archway is actually an entrance into a self-contained, somehow stabilized quantum, cosmological singularity, a black hole, then it is its own beginning and ending. Because black holes the idea is, I think that like once a star collapses, it forms a black hole. It can actually persist for some period of time before it eventually like just evaporates. If there's not enough matter and energy, eventually apparently they can, but it'll take like billions of years. So in the meantime, while the rest of the universe is progressing, like the black hole is pretty self-contained. So any matter or energy that falls into it and is trapped inside of it is unaffected at that point, basically by anything happening outside of it in the regular universe. So yeah, and maybe that's what it is. It's like I am my own beginning and end. What you do cannot even affect me.
Yeah. I think we've got a pretty sharp concept of the Guardian. I think we've got something really interesting there, and a couple things that I loved in what you mentioned, like the idea of maybe a network of Guardians of Forever throughout the universe. Each of them, not talking about the others, in order to independently measure, manage, observe, and relate to the timeline. And then also this brings up kind of the spore network from Discovery, like maybe its ability to perceive and experience all of reality has something to do with integration with the spore network. But anyway, we're going pretty deep into this one. This is great.
Well, and also I'll just point out one last thing about the network idea is if you are the network, to you, one node, in the Milky Way galaxy versus another node that's still part of your network in the Andromeda galaxy is still all you. Like if you look at your body, you don't think about the individual cells that are in your toes as being separate from you from the hair fibers or your brain cells, right? Like it's all still you. But to a flea that's on your toe, that's a vast distance away from the flea that's on your head. So, that could be the crew's perception. Like the human's perception is, oh yeah, if they did ever find like another node, like another guardian or whatever somewhere else in the galaxy, they would be like, oh, that's a second guardian. Well, but to the guardian, no. That's just another part of me. I am everything. I am the beginning and the end. I'm just one guardian.
I love that too, because, what that then suggests is that maybe the guardian is after self-preservation, ultimately. And by self-preservation, I mean the universe and a certain ordering of the universe. Because if it identifies with the whole, then, or even a network representing and having its pulse on the whole, then like the test then would take on a slightly different meaning, which is kind of like an immune response. Like, oh, are these things going to be willing to deal? Well, actually, it's also curious because one thinks, or one might imagine that the timeline after the Guardian was established is kind of its play space. Like, it no longer needs to worry about critical screw-ups. It's just ranking different timelines to figure out, all right, well, which one, as Richard said, should I fight for? But also, its own existence is secured. So I guess I'm contravening my own suggestion that it's fighting for its self-preservation because, its preservation is assured somehow. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is, if it's not worried about its own ending or it's not worried about any timeline messing with its existence, then it seems to suggest that time will continue on forever. I am the guardian of forever. That could just be a cutesy little writerly reference, or it could be a reference to the fact that matter and energy in the form of this universe or the multiverse continue forever, which, fits with all these monistic theories of I am the same as all this stuff and this stuff will survive, so ultimately I can feel okay because all of this is going to survive anyway. Something that I am will persist no matter what dies in humanity or human civilization or whatever. So that's another interesting angle to come at it with.
Also, why is it a guardian? What is it actually guarding?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think time, but in the proper flow of time, but how and what exactly does that mean? And so there are a couple other questions, and I want to go to some other people with this, Frank, but that's all awesome. That's the capstone to our articulation of the Guardian of Forever. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Some of the questions that came up for me in this episode, well, to start with the irony of the fact that Edith knew where McCoy was and probably would have helped them earlier if they told her the truth, right? But they were so committed to the integrity of the timeline, so to speak, that they didn't share it with her, even though, Kirk does seem to kind of share it with her in that Walter White speaking to what's his name in season 3 of Breaking Bad, like he asked, oh, what you got in here, a bunch of cinder blocks, bricks? And he says, $3 million in cash. And Hank was the other character's name. Hank can't believe him so strongly that he just laughed it off, but he just spoke a real truth. And so maybe Kirk was playing it that way, in the same way that the mnemonic memory circuit, that's always been my favorite kind of lie is a bold-faced truth that no one believes. And so that's what basically happens there. And then, anyway, my questions were, why didn't they at least offer Edith a choice? And I guess it was integrity of the timeline, but, he could have also brought her back with him, theoretically, thus preserving her absence from the timeline and also their love. Like he does with, he doesn't do this consciously or intentionally, but with the woman in Star Trek 4, they bring back in time, into the future. It's been done, but maybe for some reason Edith needed to die. Edith needed not just to disappear from the timeline, but her actual death contributed something.
Well, it could have been that, like, it affected somebody else who then went on to drive whatever events in time happened that needed to happen to arrive at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
It could have just been one of those people on the street seeing it happen and having been traumatized, and then that leading to a domino effect of events that went through time.
So while I'm talking to you, Ben, I've got a question for you. It's a very Ben-specific question.
Okay.
The karate chops that Dr. McCoy does.
Yeah, that was right to the kidney. That was hilarious. Frank, I'm sure you have comments on this as well, but I don't think a little bitch slap to the kidney is knocking anybody out.
Well, he did also do the second karate chop to the base of the skull.
Of course, yeah. Which an even lighter slap, yes, that could put someone into a coma if done after a kidney shot, yeah.
What would have been more realistic is that when the initial kidney shot happened, if the guy screamed out in pain, because getting punched in, well, he didn't punch him, but if you get hit hard enough in the kidney, it hurts.
Yeah, it really does hurt.
Yeah.
I mean, if he had just actually gone for really hard hits to the brainstem and gotten the medulla in the right way, he could have knocked him out or killed him. But I think that was just some 60s Hollywood fun right there.
Yeah.
That's still at a time where martial arts was viewed as this, like, mystical, magical experience that only a few were involved in, and no one knew the truth about it in the 60s. That wasn't until, early 90s, really, until the truth of martial arts really started to come out.
Yeah, well, I would... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
It sounds like it could be perceived in the same way that those hits in Kill Bill are perceived. Like, there's this magic series of hits.
Yeah, the dim Mac, yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, if that perception was present, then this would have landed in the 60s in a different way. Like, okay. Yeah, he's working martial arts voodoo on somebody.
That's precisely what that was,
Yeah. I thought it was, so to go back to some other random kind of points from the episode, I thought the this actually is related, the nerve pinch on the police officer and that whole interchange, that was just dumb. Like, it was almost like a cartoon. Like, it's a shame your wife let you go like that, and he looks at his shoulder. Like, what? No! That's not believable. But maybe
that whole interaction was pretty silly, let's be honest.
What?
That whole interaction was pretty silly, let's be honest. Like.
Yeah. Oh, Frank, was the Chinese comment just racist?
It was, but then I think the point of that scene was that he was appealing to the racism kind of inherent in that at that point in that society, and so. Yeah, it's sort of racist, but it also, I get it. Like, it served a legitimate story purpose. Because, if you're in the Deep South, for example, in the 60s, that was where you got time traveled back to. Like, you would probably, in order to fit in and survive in what could be a hostile environment, you kind of, like, have to speak their language in a way. So you probably say something disparaging about black people, I guess. So.
To fit in the great majority of racists.
Yeah,
see, racism isn't always bad.
Kirk has to sacrifice his commitment to anti-racism.
Yeah. I'm not going to go there.
It's okay, Frank, I did it.
The makeup in this episode is really funny. That Sulu's got really thick makeup on, and McCoy is hilariously insane makeup. Like, I was just like, with the blonde.
Yeah, I saw a lot of eyeshadow in this episode.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Joan Collins looked great. I mean, she looked angelic, and I think that's what they were going for. So, for that matter.
Yeah, I noticed that they do that with how they film some of those scenes. Is they, like, when they're, like, if it's McCoy and Edith having a conversation, when they cut to McCoy, he's usually shot from kind of a little bit, just slightly above eye level to McCoy. So he's just a little bit diminished. And then, he's got, just regular lighting and then the makeup and all that. And then when they cut to Edith's part of the conversation, they gel the lens or they frost it somehow, so it has a certain dreamlike quality. It diffuses light around her face, and then she has like really nice makeup. She's shot with like that. Just I don't know. The lighting is just subtly different on her, and she's shot just a little bit below eye level to give her a little bit more presence on the screen.
Yeah, she's usually shot at that Dutch angle, but she's also usually on top of something, at least in her most pivotal scenes, either on top of the stairwell or on the stage underneath the light,
Right.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And her clothing is usually fairly, maybe not necessarily bright, but a much wider color than everyone else's, giving her that angel look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They do a lot to make her, basically, to make it more tragic that she has to die because she is such a good person.
Which also, something that resonated with me is if she had just listened to Kirk at the end when he said, stay there and don't move, none of this would have happened.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a tragedy.
Oh, and Ben, you were talking before we started also, speaking of Kirk and words at the end, how bleakly it ended, right? What were your thoughts on that?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, it was almost like, you see this throughout, centuries of fiction where, you know, some characters, they have to die. That is their intention, and the story will not be complete. I mean, I usually reference Gladiator. Like, at the end of that movie, if Russell Crowe didn't die, the movie wouldn't have made sense because he fulfilled his character's purpose, and there was literally nothing else for him to do, so he had to die in order for the story to make sense. And when I say bleak, I don't necessarily mean that in any negative way. I mean, bleak is sometimes not only appropriate, but the most appropriate way to either follow or end the story. And I just, in this time period in the media, you generally didn't see a lot of that. Like, I think I referenced even the Comics Code where, I mean, think the 60s Spider-Man cartoon, you never see Spider-Man punch anyone because that was literally against the law to show that. And so I just thought it was interesting to show such like a tragedy in this way. And I think it did kind of hearken to Greek tragedies in a sense, not only with the downfall of Edith, but and her name in general. But did anyone else notice that right in front of the portal for the Guardian, there is what is obviously a Roman column right in front of it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's broken beautifully. I thought that was amazing.
Was it like a representation of the destruction of a civilization or something? Did you see any
that's one thing I have not been able to come up with an answer for that exactly. How did it get there? Was it pulled out of the portal? Was it transported onto the planet? I don't know. Like, I just think it was there as some sort of foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Also, with Kirk almost getting hit by a car, too. If you notice that. He almost gets hit by a car when they get there. Or Spock, rather, almost gets hit by a car.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Huh.
And Edith and Jim both almost get hit by a car before she actually gets hit by the truck.
That's right, yeah. We were getting teased.
By the way, I haven't been able to find the exact. There's a lot of conflicting data about this, but at the end of the episode, when Kirk says that famous line of "Let's get the hell out of here," that's at least one of the first times that someone said "hell" on TV.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, it's kind of a big deal because, you know, before that, even language was so sanitized on TV.
I saw something about like the ratings board tried to get that taken out of the show or something.
Actually, it was the studio execs. The Paramount execs thought it was too strong of a language to use for a family show, basically. But
it wouldn't have been
Roddenberry in the other spot. Yeah, no, it would definitely not have been the same.
Let's get the heck out of here.
Yeah, because after we watch someone die that has affected literally the entirety of space-time, you know, the word hell is what's going to throw people off. That 60s reasoning.
Yep.
So I feel like it's a good time to swing back around. Richard and Tyler, what other stuff did you want to cover before we go to the comic book?
I think we've covered all the main stuff. Just a few things to point out. I think what makes this episode really work on a deep level is it's not only got this high-level concept stuff, but a lot of the small details and the writing are just really good and really dramatic. Like the fact that when McCoy shows up, Spock just misses him by like a millisecond. If Spock had shown up a millisecond earlier in that soup kitchen, he would have seen him. It's just all these little details like that make it consistently engaging. It felt like watching a whole movie, really. I guess that's the focus you get from not having a B story. But it felt like, you know, this would definitely be a two-parter if it happened nowadays. But it felt like a full, great movie.
Yeah, Quentin Tarantino, who's been drawn into discussions with Paramount over a pitch for a Star Trek film. He appears on a podcast. It was like last year, early in the year, and if I recall correctly, he was talking about how if he did Star Trek today, which they're actually talking to him about doing a film, it would be either this episode or yesterday's Enterprise from The Next Generation redone, and so that would be really fascinating to see. But it's funny because like the writing is good, and I only notice what I consider to be bad writing or less than perfect writing because the rest of the writing is so good. So there's moments like when they don't look behind that one rock that McCoy's behind. Like when they first get to the planet, Uhura, and that one security officer, like they pass by that one rock. And then Nichelle Nichols was not the strongest when she said, "Captain, I'm frightened." I was just like, I mean, I got it. I got what they were intending. And like, it's only because I was paying such close attention. And then, Kirk was a little over the top when he says, "For us, time," Richard, you're going to love this, "For us, time does not exist." Right? I mean, like...
Yeah, there should still be a star date.
I mean, he should just make it the star date after the last one. Clearly he remembers the last one. And where is he recording it? On his communicator? I mean, so the communicator would be able to make sense of it. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't moments that I don't love. Like, you know how Bones always has this, "I'm a doctor, not a..." Well, he says, "I'm a surgeon, not a psychiatrist," which is the spirit of that line without the rote repetition of that line, which was cool. I liked that part. But there were just a little couple points that I think would take this away from being a 10 out of 10 for me. So anyway, I know that, Frank, you and I both read the comic. I want to give another opening salvo on the comic, far less long than the original, but I felt that the comic versus the show, like, they're both good and they're different. I ultimately like, I'd say, if forced to choose, and I don't think anybody's forcing necessarily, but if forced to choose, I like the show better. And I think there's this, so in the comic, what sends everybody down to the surface is this crewman who's trying to escape the Enterprise, and he's dealing drugs to other crew members. And he's making deals with other alien civilizations in order to make himself wealthy, and it's just like, you don't want to represent somebody who's in Starfleet like as having the capacity to do that. One imagines that you pass a certain level of ethical standards to wear that uniform, as Picard is famous for saying later on. And so he's like Lorca in Discovery, like the fact of his, Beckwith is the character's name, acting so evil, like it just doesn't really fit. And yet, in the context of the story in the comic, it still makes sense. And then in the comic, Spock is a little too aggressive, adversarial, angry, a little too emotional, but he's still smart, and I understand Ellison's constraints when he wrote it. Again, the original series hadn't reached its stride yet. We didn't know who these characters were completely yet. And the greatest thing, though, about the comics is that the Guardians of Forever is kind of a better and more intricate concept than the superficial reading most people give to the Guardian of Forever. Like, most people say, oh, the Guardian of Forever is just insane or doesn't make sense or whatever, and so they haven't done the work that we've done here. But so when you start there, when you go to the comic and you see that the Guardians of Forever was this race of beings who, they're these weird, anomalous beings, and they actually proposed the theory of the flows of time, which Spock works with, where there's a time vortex and a focal point and flows. Like, this theory is a little less easy to buy when it just comes from Spock kind of making it up. Though in the context of the story, I mean, it holds and it's the operative theory for the story. But, like, when it comes from someone else and then the characters operate on it, then it, for me, seems to be a little more palatable. But anyway, Frank, what were your thoughts on the comic and its comparativeness to the show?
So I think it's an interesting story by it, in and of itself, that, like you point out, doesn't really fit well into the Star Trek canon. So it's almost like its own like alternate Star Trek story, I guess, alternate history. So yeah, I thought it would. Well, I guess can I talk more about like Harlan Ellison and the stuff I was telling you about earlier?
Yeah, please. And I also
want
to point out before you go there that if the comic is an altered history, it's an altered history with an altered history.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Please,
What a rabbit hole. So I actually grew up kind of a fan of Harlan Ellison. He wasn't always my favorite sci-fi writer, but he definitely wrote some interesting stuff, and I really appreciated kind of his unique view on things. And so he came from a background where he was kind of like this guy who was sort of a self-made, like he lived the American dream. So he started with nothing, just had this like prolific gift of writing. Like he was like the Isaac Asimovs and the Shakespeares of the world, where he could just produce like content after content after content. And it was, for the most part, like pretty good. He had a few stinkers now and then, but he wrote something like, I think they said it was like thousands of stories. I don't remember the exact number over the course of his lifetime. So given that, it was pretty good what he wrote overall. So anyway, part of it though is that, like any other like really talented creative person, he was very opinionated, and he hated getting editorial notes back. So like for him, it was like, I wrote this thing, and this is how it's going to be published. Like I don't give a shit what you think about, this needs to be changed or blah, blah, blah. And in fact, he later on after the 60s, he notoriously like got into a fist fight with one of his editors and like beat the shit out of him. So the dude was very volatile, not exactly the most stable personality. And so, but he loved science fiction, and like he did a lot to actually get the Hugos and the Nebula Awards to become popular. Like he was like an advocate for that stuff. And so Roddenberry, when he was trying to get Star Trek off the ground, he actually came to Harlan Ellison, Theodore Sturgeon, and I forget who else, another like luminary in the golden age of sci-fi, and was like, hey, here's this idea for a show. I actually got greenlit by Paramount to produce it, and I'd love your help in getting it to be a really quality show. And that's kind of how Harlan Ellison wrote City on the Edge of Forever, is because he started through his initial conversations with Roddenberry and actually seeing some of the pre-production work that was going into the show. He really liked it and was like totally on board, became an advocate for the show, and then agreed to actually write an episode. And so for Roddenberry, it's actually a huge win because Harlan Ellison was already a big deal in the sci-fi community at that point. And so they do this, and then what I guess, I don't know, obviously I'm not privy to all the details, but apparently no one told Harlan Ellison that when you work in television or film that you're working as part of a collaborative team. Because up until that point, Ellison mainly wrote short stories and novels. And so obviously it was just him sitting at a typewriter day in and day out just writing, and then he would send it off to the publisher to get published. And so Ellison wrote the screenplay, turned it into Roddenberry, and of course Roddenberry, being the showrunner, had notes to give him, like, okay, we need to change this and tweak that and whatnot. And like that's the thing in any kind of like film or television medium or streaming medium that's scripted, you have to collaborate. I mean, you're not obviously the actor and the director and everything else either, right? So as the writer, you write the script and then turn it over. The showrunner or the director or producer will look at it, and what they're doing is not necessarily to like inhibit the writer's pure self-expression. It's more that the writer, the producer, and the director have also another role, which is they have to look at the script through the lens of, is this actually filmable? Given budgetary constraints and resource constraints, can we actually do this? And of course, being in the 60s on a CBS show, they had extreme constraints around what they had capable of being able to produce. So when Harlan Ellison turned in the script, as Lewis mentioned, it talks about the Guardians of Forever. There are 6 of them. They're these 9-foot tall, like they almost look like from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, when you see
Garden
the ring
Dome?
wraiths. No, that would have been awesome. No, they go in the opposite direction. They're like the ring wraiths when you see them as the old kings before they became monstrous, and they're like very regal, austere-looking people. So they look like that almost, and they're supposed to be encased in like almost like ice or something. Like I guess at least that's how it's portrayed in the comic adaptation of the script. But anyway, they're like these very like solemn figures, and then on top of that, in the script, Kirk and the away team actually like trek through this desert. They see the city in the distance, and that's when Kirk actually says the line about a city on the edge of forever, because it's kind of like this ethereal-looking city up in these mountains in the distance. So anyway, if you think about that, like given a TV show back in the 60s that was struggling nonetheless, there's no way they could have filmed that cheaply. Like it would have just been too much money. So they had to cut that out. And instead, in the final episode that everyone knows about now, they just beam directly down in front of the arch, and they're just there in the midst of the ruins. And even Spock says, like when McCoy beams down, Spock says the transporter was targeted at the exact center of the time vortex when that happens. So it's a very elegant way to solve that problem. Like you just need to get the away team to go down to the planet and interact with the Guardian. And so they do that. But in Harlan Ellison's script, it's much more of like a feature film where you can go on that journey, not only because you have the budget for it, but also because it just creates a sense of atmosphere if you're following your heroes traveling through this alien, weird, ethereal realm and then getting to these 6 like giant ghostly figures. It's very impressive. And so I'm sure like in Ellison's mind, and in my mind too, like, you know, if I just imagine that, it would look very cool. But obviously you can't do that on TV at that time. So they cut that. They also cut a lot of other stuff, including space pirates. So so in the script that Ellison wrote, like Lewis said, it's a guy named Beckwith. He's just this corrupt, evil Starfleet officer who's dealing drugs, and he kills actually one of the people that he's hooked on drugs. And that kind of becomes the inciting incident that makes Beckwith have to flee the Enterprise, transport down to the planet, and run. And so when they go down there, Beckwith he eventually, like, there's a struggle, and he tries to kidnap one of the away team members, and, like, they fight, they tussle, and then he jumps through the portal, and then the others then at that point have to figure out what they're going to do. So anyway, it's very exciting, but again, it kind of doesn't work. And then as soon as Beckwith goes through the portal, that's when they realize there's something wrong up with the Enterprise in orbit. So they actually beam back up to the Enterprise, and when they materialize in the transporter room, there's space pirates there that have taken over, and they call the Enterprise the Condor, I think, or something like that. It's implying like history has so changed that like apparently the Federation can't even protect their ships very well, and they're like vulnerable to pirate attacks. So there's a fight in the transporter room, and Kirk and his away team eventually, succeed. They win. They beat up the bad guys, and they seal the doors to the transporter room. But then there's more pirates outside in the rest of the ship, and they have these like bazooka-like laser guns that they point at the sealed door, and they start burning their way through. So then at that point, the Enterprise crew realize, okay, we have to send part of our team back down to the planet and fix what's been changed, while the rest of the away team stays in the transporter room to fend off the pirates if they actually break in eventually. And so, like, all that is awesome. It's exciting, but you can't film that. Like, there's just too much money that have to go into that production of that. So they cut that out. And, like, just the change after change like that infuriated Harlan Ellison, who, as I said, is already this volatile, perfectionist, egomaniac personality. And so when he realized what they were doing to his script, he basically said, it's no longer my script, and I'm done. I wash my hands of this. And that incited its own, like, feud that went on for decades, culminating with 2015 when Harlan Ellison sued CBS for what he said was all the money that they stole from that episode, that episode generated. And he actually ended up reaching a legal settlement with CBS. But his and Roddenberry's relationship was just irrevocably damaged at that point. They actually kind of started to make up a little bit in the 70s before the motion picture came out. Roddenberry actually wanted Ellison to take a crack at writing a script for the Star Trek motion picture. And they were like kind of becoming sort of friends again, but then Roddenberry blew it by insisting that in the draft of the City of the Edge of Forever script that Ellison turned in, Roddenberry somehow got into his head that in that script it was Scotty that was dealing drugs, and that he's the one that became like a maniac and they had to go chase him down to the planet, which is not, I don't know where he got that. But anyway, he kept repeating that story over and over, and he would say it in front of like conventions, in front of hundreds of people, saying, oh yeah, Ellison's a nut, like he wanted Scotty to be a drug dealer. And so Ellison again lost it, and like then at that point they just ceased speaking, and it was just bitter recriminations both ways at that point. So anyway, that's kind of the backstory to this, is that Ellison, who was like one of the biggest champions of Star Trek, ended up becoming one of its bitterest enemies. And he insists that this script is not his script, which, I mean, from a certain technical point of view, yes, that's correct. It's not really a script anymore. There were other writers that came on board at that point. But it also is kind of disingenuous on Harlan Ellison's part, because he ended up like leaving the writing team and all that. But then later that year, after the episode aired, I forget if it was the Hugos or the Nebulas, one of the equivalent of in science fiction circles of like an Oscar. One of those awards basically was like, this episode is amazing, and we're going to give you the award for best screenplay for a science fiction series. And so because when you watch the end credits of the episode, Harlan Ellison is the only writer that's listed. It's written by Harlan Ellison, when in fact it was actually other people then came in and started rewriting it. So D.C. Fontana, who's written some episodes, Gene Kuhn, Stephen Karabatsos, and Gene Roddenberry himself, they all took cracks at writing drafts of that script. But when the awards came, Harlan Ellison was the only one that went and accepted the award for it. And he even like made a snide comment about, well, I guess I'm accepting this award for this episode that isn't even mine anymore or whatever. But he still took the award. And he left his name on the script, even after Roddenberry was like, well, do you want us to take your name off of the episode? And Harlan Ellison was like kind of vacillating back and forth about it. Eventually, I think Roddenberry even said, no, you should keep your name on it because the spirit of the script is still the same as your original. And so Ellison agreed, and that's why he's the only one credited. And yet, despite all of that, he still maintained to his dying day, he died in June of this year, maintained to his dying day that was not a script, that they basically, he went so far, I think at one point, as to say that they fucked him in the ass over this script and was just so venomous about it. But yet he accepted the award and he accepted the writing credit. So, yeah.
Wow. How the tables turned. Poor Harlan. Poor crazy Harlan. So I think...
Yeah. He's a trouble genius, that was for sure.
Yeah. I think, gentlemen and gentlemen, I think we've reached the conclusion. Unless anybody has a final thought, we can go to Ray. Go ahead.
I guess I'd just like to say that what I think the tragedy of the whole backstory of all this is that Ellison never realized that those changes that others forced on his script actually made it a much better script for a TV series. And there are things in there, like in his script, Edith Keeler doesn't appear until after Spock and Kirk have been in New York, 1930s New York Earth for a while. Like they actually end up meeting some old guys. One of he's like a blind dude, ends up letting them stay in the basement and all this stuff. Edith Keeler doesn't actually live in the same building as Kirk does in the original script. And so anyway, there's all this other stuff that happens. And even the space pirate thing is kind of cool, but it sort of detracts from the story. It actually creates this whole like B story that you kind of like flip back and forth from later. And so I feel like in the changes that happened after he left, it made it a better TV script. I think that's why it's such a good television episode that's still held up and widely, like highly regarded even now, is because it streamlined all that stuff. You know, Kirk and Spock meet Edith almost right away after they sneak into the basement. She's the one that comes down to investigate and is like, who are you guys and all this stuff. And like all that just moves along so much better pacing-wise. Harlan Ellison's script, the way that it's written, I think would have actually required like a 2-episode arc instead of just one. So, and then it ends better too. I think that the romance actually I think is handled much better in the episode that we see. And then it ends with Kirk, saying, let's get the hell out of here and beaming off the planet. Whereas in Harlan Ellison's script, there's like this, they get back to the ship and there's this whole scene with Spock and Kirk where they kind of talk about like what happened and discuss their feelings. It's a good scene, it's dramatic, but it just doesn't feel like a good ending to the episode. And then the final thing that they changed that I thought was absolutely brilliant was in Harlan Ellison's script, it's only hinted. Spock speculates about why Edith Keeler must die. And he doesn't even say she must die, which is such a great line. But he says she's something like she may have to die because what if she ends up giving birth to a dictator? What if she somehow prevents the U.S. from winning the war? So it's very nebulous as to why it really even matters for Edith Keeler to die. And what they did in the episode that I think is just great is they made it definite. Spock looks through the tricorder after he fixes the homemade computer and shows Kirk this is what happens. Nazi Germany innovates the atomic bomb before the U.S. They use the V-2 rockets to launch it, implying that there's basically a nuclear Armageddon, wiping out all the Allied countries. And this is what happens. Like millions of people that weren't supposed to die have now died. So in the episode as it was filmed, it's like that conflict is super clear, and it takes away from the uncertainty of like, did Kirk do the right thing in letting her die, which is kind of what you're left with in the script, in Harlan Ellison's script. And again, that would make for an interesting, darker Star Trek series maybe, but it's not the Star Trek that Gene Roddenberry envisioned and that we have now seen in the original series. So yeah, I think Harlan Ellison missed that, that idea of like collaboration can actually heighten your work in the right circumstances. And maybe he didn't need to learn that lesson because he was so natively talented, but it could have helped, and it could have actually, who knows what else he could have gone on to write for Star Trek if he hadn't been such a pig-headed asshole about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. What could have been? I also, to speak to the comics, and one point to be made is that there's yes, it probably is a better story overall, and there are moments that I did really like. The one moment that I liked the most from the comic was the very last panel of the very last issue, where it's Kirk breaking down, like he's not just tight-lipped, and we like that portrayal of Kirk better. We like the heroic, like he's even now sacrificing his own self-expression at the end of the episode for the sake of the highest good of the crew. They don't need to see their captain messed up by something. They need to see a bastion of faith and hope and something that they can rely upon. And so he's buttoned up. But in the comic, you see him in his quarters beginning to wrestle with the issue and or the experiences he's just had, the trauma that's been inflicted upon him by his travels through time. And he's just like somewhere between despair and like just like screaming in that very last panel. You know what I'm talking about? Where it's like looking at his through the window. Yeah,
and I think that whole scene is really good, and that's so. This is what really like I feel like kind of is what Harlan Ellison failed to grasp is you can. When you write any kind of a script, when you take stuff out because you have to conform it to fit into the format of whatever the final product is, just because something gets taken out doesn't mean it's like discarded forever. Because of the nature of a television ongoing series, you can take those scenes and insert it into a future episode. And that's what would have been brilliant is later if, 2 episodes later, 3 episodes later, like Kirk has a moment where he's like, something else bad happens, he's in his room, in his quarters, and then Spock comes in and they had that scene and referencing back to what happened with him and Edith Keeler, that would have been so brilliant and so dramatic. But that's, I don't know, just Ellison just was so short-sighted in some ways and like couldn't even let that go. And so, it's lost now. But yeah, you're right. That scene is really good. And in fact, Kirk even gets emotional earlier in Harlan Ellison's script where they're still on Earth. He's fallen in love with Edith Keeler.
He falls into her arms.
Yes. Yes.
Clutches her for dear life. I was totally moved by that.
Yes. Yeah. So Kirk is like having conversation with it. I feel like the script kind of or the comic Ellison's script implies that they were almost like living together, because you see several scenes where they're in Edith's kitchen and they're like having breakfast and they're just very comfortable with each other. And so there's a scene where she's talking about the future again, like this like utopian vision that she has of it. And Kirk just like has a moment where he just grabs her and he's like closes his eyes and he's holding on to her really tightly. It's so great because it shows like he really has fallen hard for her and like cares about her. But yeah, despite all those great moments, like again, like that's the thing. I don't think Ellison realized like it doesn't mean your script is bad or people hated your script if they suggest changes. It just means they need to do that for budget constraints. And he could have kept those and inserted them later into other episodes that he would have written.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that you point to at that juncture is how, and I agree, it would have been great to have seen that scene a couple episodes later. And we're trained in the modern day in the so-called golden age of television to, which I mostly agree with. I think the TV has gotten better over time, and some of the best TV that I've seen has come out in the past, decade or so. But like we've been trained to see long-form narrative arc character development, and on the original series, it's kind of argued that you don't get that as much. You don't get it in the Next Generation, and it mostly starts in Deep Space Nine, and then you see a tiny bit of it in Voyager and a little bit in Enterprise and really intensely on Discovery. But like, the portrayal of Kirk as actually not just this icon and this myth and this representation for faith and hope in the Federation and goodness and our ideals and our ethical selves, like to have him portrayed as that human character who's suffering over time and still dealing with the aspects of things previously, like that to me stands as a reason to remake the original series, honestly. Like to have it a more dense, and I know this might be contentious, but like not a movie series, but a TV series where the characters develop and have to deal with these sorts of things. And then you could do like the Star Trek ongoing comics were produced by IDW Publishing, where you have kind of the same stories revisited, but the narrative elements are reorganized. And I think that aspect of the Kelvin trilogy was really done well in that, we're revisiting things that if you've been following the Star Trek canon for 50 years, you're familiar with, but which you can play the song in a different order with different notes or a different melody or whatever, following the metaphor very roughly there, and still have something interesting and unique and different show up. I think Harlan Ellison would have been an interesting participant in that, and it's kind of disappointing, you're right, that he took on this antagonistic relationship. Now, what would you rate, so we'll start with ratings. Frank, what would you rate the comic, and then what would you rate the episode out of 10 each?
This is my least favorite question. I hate rating things, but I guess I would say for the episode, I'm just going to rate it given the context of just the original series, not counting any of the other Star Trek series. So within the original series, I would rate the episode at a 9. For the comic, that's so hard. I liked it. I'd put it at an 8 at least.
Cool. Well, I think I'd give the comic for itself a 9, and then I'd give the episode a 9.6 or 9.7 or something. Maybe 9.65. Because we're losing precision, apparently. How about you, Ben?
I give it a 9.5.
Cool. Tyler?
I will never give you my rating.
The guardian of For Never, Tyler Brandmeier.
Ooh.
And Richard?
10 out of 10. Why not?
Really? You think it was a perfect episode?
Yeah, I would have no reservations recommending this to anyone to watch at any time.
Yeah, it was one of the first ones I ever showed to my girlfriend. So, and she enjoyed it. She was fairly taken in by it. Well, thank you all for being here, Ben, Richard, Tyler, Frank. It's been an honor, and be careful, because artificial superintelligences may suddenly include you in their plans. To everyone,
I'm looking forward to it.
good night.